If you're looking for a leverless controller and you don't like the ergonomics of having your hands crushed together here in the middle, then you might be interested in this. It's the TIKITAKA FTG S series. This is called the S15, and the reason it's called that is because it is a split button layout. Now, these FTG TIKITAKA controllers come in a very cheap looking box, which actually kind of warps and bends in the process of being shipped to you. But on the inside, after you get rid of the plastic, you have the controller itself and a little bag with accessories. Now, before I take the controller out of this cling film, just want to point out the product was sent to me free of charge for the purposes of making this video. Haven't been instructed to say anything specific about it, and all opinions are my own. Not 100% sure if it is microwave safe. Not that that should be... Ugh! What is this stuff? So here's the controller itself, and as you can see, it is ever so slightly separated in the middle. This one is slightly spaced apart. Now, I haven't decided which layout I actually prefer, but I do think there might be an advantage to having a split layout because of the angle of your ring finger on the left. So without further delay, let's jump into some fighting games and see if this split layout is actually split far enough for it to really feel more ergonomic. Alright, as you can see, I've got the S15 here set up here with Street Fighter 6, but before I go into any details about this, I just want to point out that I do have a separate video that goes through most of the basics of these cheap leverless controllers. But for the specifics of the S15, let's get into it. Now, the first thing you're going to notice immediately with this controller is that the layout is different. Normally with a leverless controller, the basic layout that most people use is with your hands right here, with the jump button in the middle and your fingers close together like this. But as you can see with this split button layout, we have them about 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches further apart, which means that you can actually space the buttons out in a very different way. We've got a jump button up here, but you can also have different profiles set up. Now, at the moment, it's meant to be turbo, but I've actually changed this to be a function key so that I can load separate profiles, and now I can actually jump with this, and this button is now deactivated. One of the benefits of the S15, of course, is that you have both layouts. If you want to jump with your right thumb over here, or if you want to set it for your left thumb to jump over here, you could do that as well. But I've got two profiles set up, one with the up button over here with WSAD style controls, and then I just switch profiles, and then I can jump with this one instead. Of course, if you wanted to make your own custom configuration where every single button on the controller was up, you could also do that. I don't think it would be tournament legal, but you could try it. I have to admit that this is actually a very nice, very comfortable position, especially if you're playing at a desk. Now, if you do play at a desk, you'll find that your hands come at a pretty good angle, and what I'm happy to report is that it doesn't force your hand to be like this angle. So a lot of the issues that beginners find on leverless controllers is that it's quite difficult to do a dragon punch on the right side and the left side. So if I'm on the right side over here, doing a dragon punch means I have to use my ring finger. And if you've never tried this before, I welcome you to try it right now, even on a keyboard, or if you don't have a controller yet. You have to do the dragon punch motion like this. It's actually quite difficult if you've never done it before, and being consistent with this and making sure that you actually end on the right inputs and you don't skip any inputs and you have all the buttons come in at the right time. This can be tricky at first. Obviously, you get used to it, but even after years of doing it, you may find that it's still quite difficult. If you are one of those people, you probably want to try a split button layout, because as you can see, with your hands in like this, you can see your hands just kind of naturally kind of tilt over. It can be kind of more difficult to press these buttons over here if your hands are at this angle. Having a more and more split apart position, it kind of helps a little bit with having your hands in an actual prone position when you're typing. So those are the main benefits of having a split pad layout if you're interested in that sort of thing. But the other things that you might be interested with this controller are how are the rest of the buttons set up. So let's say that you're using right thumb jump as I am in this layout. That means you've got 1, 2, 3 extra buttons that you can use for shortcuts. Now, they might not be in the same positions as other controllers that I've reviewed recently, but you do have them in useful places. Like over here, I use this one for drive impact, so I have easy access with my left hand to do drive impact whenever I need to. And when I need to use the parry button, I've actually got this button set over here so that I can do nice and easy drive rushes like this, so I can run straight in and surprise my enemy. That is the name of the game. We call it Surprise Fighter 6. Now, it's quite useful to have an extra button up here for shortcuts, but I'm going to be honest, I would much prefer to have had this button down here. I'm not really sure why they didn't just call it the S16 and just put an extra button here. I don't know if that was, maybe there's a cost-cutting measure, or maybe they just thought it looked more unique this way. But the controller itself is nice and simple. It's thin, so it's easy to use on a desk without any kind of wrist rest. You can just put your hands on your desk and it's fine, or you can have your hands on the actual controller itself and there's no issue there. It's nice and slim. These buttons are also nice and easy to press. They're not painful at all and they're nice and wide. I'm happy to see that these buttons are nice and big. The touchpad button, I feel like it would be nice if there were just a giant touchpad in the middle of the thing, but I'm not super keen on these controllers that have like a teeny tiny touchpad button. But most of these cheap leverless controllers all have the same layouts. Basically they'll just put a teeny tiny button here, not as useful as having a giant touchpad button. Design wise, it's very basic. You know, it's a slab of plastic and they've got a bunch of screws in it. There's no hiding the screws. They haven't made them like flush with the top of the controller to make it nice and smooth, and even on the back of the controller it's not that smooth either. They do bump up out of the controller, and as a result you can't really put it on your desk without these non-slip rings, which they've put around 6 of the screws, and that's good that that's there because it does prevent the controller from slipping around on your desk. But just to show you, even if you have it on your lap, it's nice and comfortable. It's super wide. If you have your legs obviously super wide open, it will fall through, but it's basically like the size of an A4 sheet of paper, so it's not going to fall off your lap. And again, with these leverless controllers, you're not really at risk of it slipping off your lap unless you've got a really terrible posture. So one of the main things you may be wondering is, how am I switching between these two profiles? Well, I'm holding down the turbo button, and obviously it's not meant to do this, but I've actually programmed it myself. So this is where the controller starts to get a little bit more complicated, because this button here is set to function. So I hold down function and I press this button to go into profile 1, which is using the up button over here to jump. But if I go turbo and then I press the B button, then I switch over to load profile 2, so I can actually use this button over here for jumping instead. There are not that many extra buttons to play with. We've got the home, turbo, select, touchpad, and start. So I guess maybe I could have set it as the touchpad, but basically I don't use the turbo function anyway, so I figured I'll just replace turbo with the function setting. But this is something that I did because I understand how to configure the controller myself. Unfortunately, FTG TIKITAKA doesn't really give you very much information. You get this piece of paper, which does explain most of the features of the controller, but it feels like FTG doesn't really know all about the GP2040 firmware that's in this controller. And as a result, it means that this instruction manual is missing lots of key information. And let's go into it. So what actually happens is, when you open up the controller for the first time, you've got a jump button here, and you've got a jump button here, and I think this is actually set to, yeah, something like, I don't know, drive impact. So I guess this is probably L3. But if you're like most leverless users and you actually use this button to jump, there's just no explanation on how to actually set that up. So you have to go into the GP2040 web configurator, and the way to do that is to hold down the start button, plug this into your PC. You need a computer or a Mac or something with a web browser so that you can access the firmware and actually change the settings so that it's got this set to jump. The next thing that's confusing is that even after you've used the web configurator to set this button as your jump button, like so, it doesn't show you how to use load profile. Now, there's no actual hotkey that I can find by default, so I actually had to set my own hotkey. And because there is no function key built into the controller, I had to replace the turbo button with the function button. So for every single profile, and there are 4 profiles, I had to change this pin, turbo, to be function, and then I had to go to a separate menu and I had to change function plus A to be load profile 1, function plus B to load profile 2. And as you can see, it's confusing for a beginner because nothing is labeled on the front of the controller. What you do get instead is, on this instruction manual, you get a kind of guide that tells you which pins they are. So when you're in the web configurator, it's like, okay, well, pin number 23 is the one I want to set to up. So you have to like find it in the menus and go, okay, pin 23 is up. If you are a professional when it comes to GP2040, so you understand the tech, this is not going to be an issue whatsoever. Obviously, loading profiles and resetting the pins, you're going to have absolutely no problem with the S15 by FTG TIKITAKA, except if you press the danger zone. So let me introduce you to the next most interesting part of this information, and it's the fact that it actually has a warning. Never click on the red danger zone reset settings. If you click, it will cause all configurations to be lost and the product cannot be used. Well, I'm a little bit scared of the danger zone button now, but at the time when I was testing out the firmware, I didn't know that. So I just clicked danger zone, as I always do with other controllers, because many other controllers use this exact same firmware. And I clicked danger zone and I lost the settings. Literally could not find a way to retrieve a lot of these buttons. They just stopped working, and I had to email FTG TIKITAKA. You actually have to send an email to this email address and ask them for the firmware to like re-flash the product. There's not really instructions on how to flash it, so I had to go on the GP2040 website and I had to figure out how to flash the original GP2040 firmware onto the controller, then use the firmware to go into a menu and load the data back up, which I was also provided. I had to load that file, and then I had it back in default mode. Obviously, it's using the same firmware that everyone has been using in other controllers, but it's a little bit different. And obviously, pressing the button reset, which should just reset the settings and put it back in default mode, that actually breaks the controller, and there's no way to get it back apart from emailing the company. Now, I asked them if this file will be provided on a website. They said they're working on the website, but it's under construction. I'm going to put this review out, but there is no website where you can currently download any of these files to reset your controllers. So keep in mind, if you're a beginner, or even if you're like a tech enthusiast and you understand this stuff, if you want to reset the controller back to default settings, the only way to do it, I guess, is to back up the file yourself, if you know how to do that, or send an email to the company and just hope that they reply with the file. As you can see, there's no feedback on the controller telling me what profile I'm in. There are no lights on the controller, and there are no screens on the controller. Now, with GP2040, a lot of it does rely on having a screen so you know what specific settings you've changed. It's got a lot of great functionality, and so none of this really is the fault of the firmware. So especially with a controller where you have options between up button over here or up button over here, I really want it to be from the get-go. When I get out the box, I want a keyboard shortcut on the instructions telling me how do I switch between, you know, WSAD controls and right thumb jump controls, or even left thumb jump controls. Those profiles really do need to be set up before they sell the controller. But as you can see, once it is all set up, you've got no issues whatsoever with using the controller. It does pretty much you would expect. You've got all these buttons to play with and do whatever you want with them. You've got these option buttons which you can set up any way you like. It's just a little bit frustrating that there's no screen here so I can actually see what I'm doing. Now, one more thing that's frustrating is that because there's no homepage, there's no way to actually give you this information apart from the AliExpress sales page. And on the sales page, it says never click update to the latest version, because obviously, just like clicking Danger Zone, that will bring the new GP2040 firmware up to date, and you'll lose a lot of settings that make this controller work. So you're not allowed to click Danger Zone to reset the settings, and you're also not allowed to update to the latest GP2040 firmware. So if they discover a bug in the firmware that needs to be changed for your controller to be tournament legal, you really are at the mercy of FTG TIKITAKA sending you an update made by them for this controller. That's not really unique to this company. Obviously, there are a large number of other companies who have like custom Brook boards, and they will have to send you their own firmware if there needs to be an update to the software and all that. But it's something to keep in mind, because you may be thinking, I'm buying a nice cheap controller that runs GP2040, but it actually kind of doesn't. It's got special settings that they need to send to you via email, otherwise there's no way to like reset the controller. One thing I will say is that the buttons do actually feel quite nice. I like that they've actually got rims around the button. It means that the buttons are nicely spaced apart so that you can nicely double tap them. That's not what I expected to happen, but something that does happen with these 3D printed buttons is that obviously, depending on who does the 3D printing, they will be either, you know, really tightly fit into these key switches or not so much. And as you can see, mine has just kind of flipped off. One thing that is interesting about this controller is that they say that it works on PS4 on the website, and they do not explain at all what that really means. So when you actually plug it into your PS4, you will discover, of course, that after 8 minutes, this controller just stops working. Why? Because it's using GP2040, which never promised to work on PS4. It is compatible with PS4 if you use an adapter, but if you don't use an adapter, you really are just using an unlicensed controller with no authentication. So after 8 minutes, it will be disconnected from your PS4 or PS5, even if you're in PS4 mode. Either they're just not advertising it, or they just don't know that it doesn't really work on PS4. It does work for the first 8 minutes though, and then after that, you're going to be a little bit stuck. You're going to have to unplug the controller and plug it back in, or you're going to have to buy yourself an authentication device like a Magic Boots USB dongle, or plug into an actual PS4 controller, like I've had to do for other controllers. Totally fine, but it's just a bit strange that they don't mention it on the website at all. So that's pretty much everything you need to know about the controller. It's obviously nice to have this split button layout. We have a large number of extra buttons, and you have the flexibility of going between profile 1, or I mean, you can set it up yourself. You can have 4 profiles. You can have a profile set with up, jump over here, WSAD style, or you can have a separate profile over here where you can jump with your right thumb. So to summarize my thoughts on the S15, here's what I'm going to say. This is not an expensive controller. At $108, this is significantly cheaper than an officially licensed controller, and it does have a large number of extra buttons and this split button layout, which you don't see that commonly. But at the same time, it's not the cheapest. I am concerned about things like the buttons coming off in the middle of gameplay. I do find it kind of strange the way that the firmware can't be updated or reset without having to email the company for a replacement firmware file. It is also strange that there's no homepage that's actually been set up yet, even though they're sending out these review products. Also, it is kind of inconvenient that there's no screen here, so even though it has the ability to switch between the profiles, the fact that I switch to this profile, it doesn't actually tell me that I'm in profile 1 or not, and then I go over to profile 2, you know, there's no visual indication of what's going on there. That does seem to be like a little bit of an oversight. I would have happily paid more money if it were more robust, and I would also prefer to have a screen and some kind of visual feedback about, you know, what mode I'm in at the time. But if these things are all okay with you and you understand what you're getting yourself into, it is kind of a complicated situation. You do have, for $108 on AliExpress, a split button layout controller, which is leverless. Listen, that's all I've got time for. If you are going to go for this controller, be sure that you understand the complications that you're getting into, but I think I've explained as much as I possibly can here today. If you liked this video, be sure to click the like button, subscribe to the channel for more, and watch this video next if you want to see everything you need to know about leverless controllers, especially these cheap leverless controllers and what you're really getting into and all the complications that come with it. That's all for now. I've been NihongoGamer. I'll see you real soon.